Usually when we cue up a piece of music today, we are listening to a digital construct.
Right, it's highly processed.
Exactly. The tracks are pristine, they're perfectly aligned to a grid, scrubbed of any human error, and probably assembled on a laptop by producers working across, like, 3 different time zones.
Yeah, which is an incredible technological achievement, honestly.
Oh, for sure. But it is surgically clean. The instruments are completely isolated from one another in a vacuum.
You never hear the physical environment. I mean, you hear the isolated vibration of a guitar string, but you don't hear the ream that the guitar is actually sitting in.
Right. But then you put on a pair of really high-quality headphones and play an acoustic jazz record from, say, 1959. Suddenly, that whole illusion shifts.
Yeah, it's a totally different experience.
You are no longer just streaming a digital file. You are sitting inside a specific physical room. You can actually hear the air moving through the bell of a trumpet.
Or the rosin catching on the thick strings of an upright bass before the note even fully blooms.
Yes, audiophiles actually have a very specific term for this, right?
Yeah, they say a record has air. You are hearing the microscopic delay of a cymbal crash bouncing off a wooden beam and making its way back to the microphone. You're hearing the acoustic signature of a physical space, captured in real time by a group of human beings just breathing the same oxygen.
Welcome to the deep dive. For you, the listener, our fellow learner who loves those intense aha moments without getting bogged down in an avalanche of information, we have mapped out an incredible journey today.
We really have. We're looking at this 29-track Audiophile Jazz Essentials notebook you provided us.
And our mission today is to dissect this magical, roughly 7-year window, stretching mostly from 1957 to 1964. Almost all of this essential catalog emerged from just 2 New York-based record labels, Blue Note and Columbia.
Right, and that tiny 7-year sliver of time produced more enduring, culturally defining acoustic jazz records than any other comparable stretch in the history of the music.
It's just a dense cluster of pure innovation.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because it is wild to think that such a brief era could completely define an entire genre for eternity.
It really is.
To figure out why those 7 years were so explosive, we have to look at the musical climate that preceded it, right? Like, the generation before this was dominated by bebop.
Exactly. Bebop was co-invented in the 1940s by innovators like Charlie Parker and Dizzy Gillespie.
Right.
And to understand bebop, you have to understand that it was a deliberate rebellion against the heavily structured, dance-focused big bands of the swing era.
They wanted people to actually sit and listen.
Yes, exactly. Bebop musicians wanted to play music that demanded serious listening, not dancing. So they made it impossibly fast, harmonically dense, and incredibly complex.
I mean, it required massive athletic technical skill just to survive on the bandstand.
It was exhausting to play. But by the late 1950s, that sheer, exhausting complexity had finally been fully digested by a new generation of players.
They had grown up playing bebop. Right. They no longer felt the need to just demonstrate their technical chops at lightning speed to prove they belonged.
The tempo could finally relax a bit.
Exactly. And they were ready to start innovating with a language rather than just reciting it.
But before we get into the musicians who completely rewrote the rulebook, we have to talk about the canvas they were painting on.
Oh, absolutely. The room itself.
Because the reason audiophiles still obsess over these specific tracks isn't just the brilliant playing. It's the physical, tactile sound of the recordings themselves. We have to look at Rudy Van Gelder.
Yeah, he is the definitive architect of that air we were just talking about. And his trajectory is just completely unconventional.
It's so weird. By day, Rudy Van Gelder was a practicing optometrist.
Fitting people for glasses.
Literally fitting people for glasses. But by night, he was recording the most legendary figures in jazz history in his parents' living room in Hackensack, New Jersey.
Which is just crazy to picture.
We're talking about monumental historic records, John Coltrane's Blue Train, Cannonball Adderley's something else.
These massive cultural touchstones were literally being laid down next to the Van Gelder family sofa.
It's hilarious. But the living room actually had a surprisingly warm sound.
It did. But by 1959, he finally left optometry behind entirely and moved his operation into a custom-built studio in Inglewood Cliffs.
Right, and he had it designed by David Henkin, who was an architect and a student of Frank Lloyd Wright.
Which is a huge detail. Having a Frank Lloyd Wright disciple design a recording studio brings a very specific organic philosophy to the architecture.
It was acoustically revolutionary, wasn't it?
Completely. The studio featured a massive 32-foot ceiling supported by thick, laminated wood beams.
So when you hear the Great Blue Note records from 1959 onward, you are hearing that specific room.
Think about how sound waves operate. When a saxophone blasts a loud note in a small room, the sound waves hit the flat drywall instantly and bounce back.
Creating a harsh, muddy echo.
Exactly. But with a 32-foot ceiling, that sound wave has room to travel upward, expand, and naturally dissipate. The sharp edges of the sound wear off before bouncing back down.
And you combine that with the warm resonance of those heavy wood beams, and you get Van Gelder's unmistakable signature.
Right, the crisp cymbals, a piano that feels remarkably present. Saxophones push slightly forward in the mix.
And an upright bass that has a heavy physical weight without ever turning into sonic mud.
Exactly.
But Rudy Van Gelder was also fiercely, notoriously secretive about his process. Like, he used very minimal micing, capturing the band mostly direct to two-track tape.
And he flat out refused to explain his techniques to anyone.
Right. Rival engineers would occasionally book time just to try and steal a glance at his microphone placements, and they would leave completely baffled.
He was like a master chef guarding a secret recipe. And he took those secrets directly to the grave when he died in 2016.
But I want to push back on the mythology here for a second. We get so caught up in the lore of his top-secret microphone placements.
Sure.
But I wonder if the magic of these recordings was really about his hidden techniques. Was it simply the massive cathedral-like acoustic architecture of that 32-foot room doing the heavy lifting?
That's a great question.
Like, you put a good band in a great room, and maybe the microphones don't matter as much as we think.
What's fascinating here is that Van Gelder's true genius wasn't just his technical mic placements or even the architecture of the room. It was his overarching philosophy.
How so?
He treated the instruments naturally. He understood that an upright bass isn't just a low-frequency tone generator. It is a giant, hollow wooden box with thick strings stretched across it.
He wanted you to hear the wood.
Exactly. He recorded the piano like a complex mechanical machine of hammers and wires. He wasn't trying to manufacture a pristine artificial sound.
His goal was to honestly document physical objects vibrating in a shared space.
Precisely.
So he built the perfect, honest acoustic canvas. But 1959 was the year the musicians completely revolutionized what was being painted on it.
Oh, the sheer creative output of that single year is staggering to look at.
Right. Within a 12-month window, the world got Miles Davis's Kind of Blue, Dave Brubeck's Time Out, Charles Mingus's Mingus, and John Coltrane's Giant Steps.
It is essentially the Big Bang of modern jazz.
And the epicenter of that explosion is undeniably Miles Davis and the album Kinda Blue.
Specifically the opening track, So What? This was the founding, definitive statement of modal jazz.
Now, modal jazz sounds like an intimidating piece of heavy music theory.
It really does.
But the emotional effect on the listener is instantaneous. We should probably break down how this actually works mechanically.
Good idea. Up until this specific moment, jazz improvisation was almost entirely built on complex chord changes. Soloists were constantly navigating harmonic structures that shifted every 2 to 4 measures.
Okay.
If you picture a maze where the walls are constantly rearranging themselves every few seconds, that is what improvising over bebop chord changes feels like.
You are always running just to keep up with the harmony.
Exactly. But Miles Davis, drawing heavily on the theories of composer George Russell, decided to simply throw out the maze.
Wow.
Instead of dense shifting chords, he gave his musicians modes, essentially just specific scales to play with.
And crucially, he let each scale run for 16 bars at a time before changing.
Right. By stretching one scale across 16 measures, the harmonic motion slowed down to a crawl.
The musicians didn't have to worry about navigating a frantic obstacle course of chords anymore.
They could focus entirely on pure melody. And the result was incredibly meditative, spacious, and cinematic.
And the physical space they recorded it in perfectly mirrored that spaciousness. They cut Kinda Blue in Columbia's 30th Street studio in Manhattan,
Which was a converted Greek Orthodox church.
with 100-foot ceilings.
It's massive.
They literally had 100 feet of pure acoustic space expanding above their heads while they played these slow, lingering modal scales.
And the pianist on that session, Bill Evans, wrote a famous set of liner notes for the album where he compared the recording process to traditional Japanese ink painting.
Where you make a single deliberate stroke on the parchment and you cannot erase or revise it.
Right. Almost the entirety of Kinda Blue was captured in first or second takes.
That is insane.
A brilliant detail from that specific session, actually, the famous opening of So What, That iconic, slow, brooding call-and response between the bass and the horns.
Yeah.
It was actually developed and played on the piano by Bill Evans first. It was only later transferred to Paul Chambers to play on the upright bass.
I had no idea. Now, while Miles Davis is creating this vast, slow, meditative architecture, you have the Dave Brubeck Quartet releasing Time Out in that exact same year.
Featuring the legendary track, Take 5.
Right. And they are attacking the genre from a completely different angle. Take 5 is built entirely on a 54-time signature.
Which Columbia Records strongly opposed releasing, by the way.
They were convinced that a jazz instrumental in 54-time had zero commercial viability.
And honestly, their hesitation makes perfect sense from a structural standpoint. Western ears are deeply conditioned to crave symmetry.
We expect music in 4 beats to a measure 1, 2, 3, 4.
Exactly, because it mirrors the human heartbeat or the rhythm of walking. A 54-time signature, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, feels inherently unstable.
It has a limp.
Right. It feels like a skipped heartbeat or a lopsided walk. It creates a mild, underlying psychological tension.
But Brubeck fought the executives, and it ultimately became the best-selling jazz single in history.
And Paul Desmond, the alto saxophonist who actually composed the melody, ended up willing all of his royalties for the song to the American Red Cross.
They've collected millions of dollars over the decades from that one lopsided rhythm.
It's amazing. And the mechanical reason that strange 54-time signature actually worked instead of falling apart was the drummer, Joe Morello.
Because before he ever picked up drumsticks, Morello was a classically trained violinist.
Yes, that classical background is the secret ingredient. Having the melodic and dynamic control of a violinist allowed Morello to keep that weird, stumbling 54 rhythm feeling fluid.
A lesser drummer would have made playing in 5 sound like a rigid, stressful math exercise.
But Morello made the math actually groove.
Here's where it gets really interesting. You have this massive contradiction happening simultaneously in 1959.
Oh, for sure.
Miles Davis revolutionizes jazz by stripping away the chords, slowing it down, and making it impossibly spacious. Meanwhile, Dave Brubeck revolutionizes it by turning the rhythm into a complex, asymmetrical math equation.
2 totally different directions.
Both of these are extreme, avant-garde experiments, yet both of them became massive, mainstream pop culture hits. Why was the general public suddenly so willing to consume such deeply challenging experimental music?
Well, the success really comes down to the fact that underneath the heavy theory, underneath the modal scales and the strange time signatures, the underlying pulse of the music remained deeply human and incredibly accessible.
Okay, that makes sense.
You didn't need a degree in music theory or an understanding of George Russell's concepts to feel the late-night smoky cool of so what.
And you didn't need to consciously count to 5 to bob your head to take 5?
Exactly. The musicians were connecting with a primal mood, and that emotional clarity allowed the average listener to just bypass the intellect and feel it.
That visceral emotional connection brings us to another massive shift happening at the exact same time. While Kinda Blue was capturing this cool, spacious aesthetic, the clubs on the East Coast were boiling over with a fierce, aggressive sound called hard bop.
We should probably establish a baseline here.
Yeah, let's do that.
In the early 1950s, a subgenre called cool jazz had emerged, largely out of California. It was breezy, relaxed, intellectual, and heavily influenced by classical music restraint.
Think of a sunny drive down the Pacific Coast Highway.
Right. Hard bop was the East Coast's aggressive, bluesy, church-rooted response to that. It was visceral and sweaty.
And Blue Note Records became the definitive documentary label for this hard bop explosion.
You had foundational groups like Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers.
Art Blakey sat behind that drum kit like a fiery conductor, and his band functioned as the ultimate finishing school for young prodigies.
The roster of kids who passed through his ranks is staggering. Wayne Shorter, Freddie Hubbard, Wynton Marsalis.
The visceral intensity of hard bop, with its deep gospel chords and aggressive tempos, was a direct reflection of the volatile, highly pressurized, and often tragic lives of the people playing it.
Yeah, that's the dark side of this era.
When you look at the pop culture endurance of these upbeat, soulful anthems alongside the harsh realities of the artists who wrote them, the contrast is just jarring. Look at Lee Morgan.
Oh man, Lee Gordon.
He was an absolute prodigy playing on Coltrane's Blue Train when he was just 19 years old. He wrote The Sidewinder, which became such a massive commercial hit that Chrysler used it in a national TV ad during the World Series.
And that one song single-handedly kept Blue Note Records solvent during a financial crisis.
Yet his life ended in a scenario that sounds sounds like a tragic film noir.
It really does.
Yeah.
In 1972, at just 33 years old, Morgan was playing a gig at a notorious New York club called Slug's Saloon.
Right.
His personal life was deeply chaotic. He had been abusive, he was struggling with addiction, and he was carrying on an affair.
And his common-law wife, Helen, finally reached her breaking point.
She walked into the club during a blinding snowstorm, shot him dead between sets, and quietly waited for the police to arrive.
It is a horrific end. And the history of this entire era is deeply entangled with that kind of tragedy.
You have Sonny Clark, an exceptionally lyrical pianist, dying of a suspected heroin overdose at 31.
You have John Coltrane having to lock himself in his mother's house in 1957 to detox cold turkey just to survive long enough to reach his artistic peak.
It was a brutal time.
But I want to push back on the romanticized, tortured jazz genius trope that often dominates these conversations. Society loves to draw a straight line between self-destruction and profound art.
Implying you need the drugs to access the genius.
Exactly. But then you look at Clifford Brown. By all accounts, he was the most naturally gifted, fiery trumpeter of his generation. He didn't drink, he didn't use drugs, he lived a completely clean life in an industry saturated with vice.
Clifford Brown deliberately proved to his peers, especially to a young Sonny Rollins who completely idolized him, that you absolutely did not need to destroy your mind or body to play this music with deep, burning intensity.
Right. And the heartbreak is that Clifford Brown dies in a horrific car crash on the Pennsylvania Turnpike at age 25.
He was completely sober.
It was viewed by the jazz community as a massive, cosmic injustice. But looking at his life proves that the tragedy and the addiction were not prerequisites for the art.
They were just massive obstacles the artist had to overcome.
Exactly.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we have to recognize the brutal environment they were operating in. This was a relentless, punishing gig economy.
Right. These musicians were playing 3 or 4 sets a night, traveling constantly in cramped cars.
Dealing with overt systemic racism across the country, and operating with zero financial safety nets or health insurance.
That environment naturally creates a high-stakes pressure cooker.
It forged incredibly diamond-hard art, yes. But the intense heat of that pot inevitably broke many of the brilliant minds trapped inside it.
Even the eccentric geniuses who managed to survive developed legendary coping mechanisms to deal with the pressure.
Oh, definitely. Like Sonny Rollins.
Right, he felt his playing was stagnating, so he simply quit performing, took a 2-year sabbatical, and spent his days practicing alone on the pedestrian walkway of the Williamsburg Bridge.
Incredible. And Dizzy Gillespie pushed his physical body so hard for so long that he developed medically anomalous cheek pouches that would balloon out to absurd proportions.
He even ran for president in 1964 as a satirical stunt to highlight civil rights. He promised to name Duke Ellington as his Secretary of State.
I love that. And then there's Thelonious Monk, a composer famous for his jagged, intentional dissonances. He made the cover of Time magazine in 1964, only to completely withdraw from the world a decade later.
He spent the last 6 years of his life in a New Jersey home in near total self-imposed silence.
Yet the music forged in that pressure cooker endures in ways none of them could have ever predicted. Decades later, Steely Dan lifted the iconic descending bass line from Horace Silver's Song for My Father almost note for note.
Just anchored their massive pop hit, Ricky, Don't Lose That Number, right on top of it.
Right.
Or Herbie Hancock's Cantaloupe Island. Herbie recorded that track in 1964 featuring a drummer, Tony Williams, who was only 18 years old at the time.
And nearly 30 years later, the British hip-hop group US3 sampled that exact recording for their hit Cantaloupe, Flip Fantasia.
The royalties generated from that one 90s hip-hop sample reportedly funded a massive chunk of the entire Blue Note vinyl reissue program.
That's crazy to think about.
A modern hip-hop loop is quite literally the financial reason we can still buy these pristine 1960s acoustic records today.
It is a beautiful full-circle moment. But while we focus heavily on the famous frontmen, the names in bold print on the album covers, we have to acknowledge that the true identity of this era was heavily shaped by figures operating quietly in the shadows.
Absolutely. Think about Billy Strayhorn. If you ask anyone to name the Duke Ellington Orchestra's signature theme, they will immediately say, "Take the A Train."
But Duke Ellington didn't write it.
Billy Strayhorn did. They met in 1939, and Duke gave the young composer literal subway directions to his Harlem apartment.
Telling him to take the A train to Sugar Hill.
And Strayhorn turned those literal transit directions into an immortal jazz standard.
Strayhorn served as Duke's closest collaborator and uncredited alter ego for nearly 30 years. What makes his story even more remarkable is that Strayhorn was openly gay in an era where that was not just heavily stigmatized, but physically and professionally dangerous.
He survived and thrived because Duke Ellington fiercely protected him.
Yes, he created a safe ecosystem within the band where Strayhorn's genius could just flourish.
That underlying danger brings up the massive cultural weight of this entire era. That magical 1957 to 1964 window wasn't just a period of musical innovation.
No, it coincided exactly with the absolute peak of the American Civil Rights Movement.
Jim Crow segregation laws were still brutally enforced across much of the country.
The tension of that reality bleeds directly into the music. Charles Mingus, a brilliant, bipolar, volcanic bassist who once literally knocked his own trombonist's teeth out over a musical disagreement.
Oh, wow.
He channeled that intense racial tension directly into his compositions. Albums like Mingus, um, don't just sound heavy. They are physically heavy with the volatile reality of navigating America as a black man in the late 1950s.
But even when the protest wasn't explicitly written into the song titles, it was happening implicitly on the bandstands.
Right.
In a legally segregated country, you had Bill Evans, a white man, sitting at the piano taking direction from Miles Davis. Dave Brubeck led a mixed quartet.
Because of the music, these bandstands were often the most radically integrated rooms of whatever town they were playing in.
So what does this all mean when we look at how this intense, heavily racialized, emotionally draining movement was ultimately packaged and sold to the public?
Because the person who defined the visual aesthetic of this movement was another shadow figure, Reed Miles.
Reed Miles is the man who single-handedly invented the visual language of cool.
He designed the iconic Blue Note album covers, the dramatic tilted sans serif typography, the moody two-color ink palettes.
The extreme cropping of Francis Wolff's session photographs. If you see a hip graphic design today, there is a very good chance it is borrowing heavily from Reed Miles.
But the astonishing part of his story is that he couldn't read music, and he actively disliked jazz.
It's unbelievable. He was designing the visual identity of a musical revolution he didn't even care to listen to.
It feels like an architect designing a breathtaking, award-winning home that they would personally despise living in.
Yeah. How does someone capture the soul of a movement they aren't emotionally invested in?
This raises an important question about how art functions in society. Art can often transcend the individual creator's personal biases or preferences.
That makes sense.
Think about those integrated bandstands we discussed. The musicians on stage were modeling a collaborative, equal society that simply did not exist outside the doors of the nightclub yet.
They were prototyping the future.
Exactly. Reed Miles, by distancing himself completely from the intense emotional and racial weight of the music, was able to distill its energy into pure geometry. He treated the covers purely as a graphic design problem.
By stripping away his own emotional investment, he inadvertently created a universal, slick, visual language for cool that invited everyone in.
Regardless of whether they understood the complexities of the hard bop playing on the record.
It is a phenomenal, sweeping journey. When you step back and look at the scope of this notebook, you start out standing next to a sofa in Rudy Van Gelder's parents' living room in Hackensack.
Right.
You move to the soaring 100-foot acoustic heights of a converted church in Manhattan for Kind of Blue. You navigate the tragic bloody ends on the floor of Slug's Saloon.
And you end up bearing witness to integrated bandstands that quietly, radically defined a legally segregated nation.
And every single piece of that history was captured in a roughly 7-year flash of sustained brilliance.
It's truly unmatched.
So the next time you put on a good pair of headphones to listen to this era of music, take a moment to remember what you are actually tuning into.
You aren't just hearing a group of guys executing notes on instruments.
You're hearing a physical room breathe. You are hearing the joy, the exhaustion, the tragedy, and the heavy cultural weight of a deeply divided America, captured perfectly in analog amber.
It functions as an auditory time machine, meticulously preserved by engineers and artists who possessed the wisdom to let the wooden boxes and brass bells simply speak for themselves.
But I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to ponder today, drawing on everything we've explored. Rudy Van Gelder famously took his analog engineering secrets to the grave, right?
He deliberately frustrated everyone who ever tried to decode his mastery.
Right. Today, we live in an era defined by open source knowledge. Everything is a digital tutorial away. Every technique is eventually dragged into the light, decoded, and shared on a grid.
That's true.
But when you listen to the unmatched warmth, depth and mysterious air of these specific records, is there a hidden cost to losing the mystery, the fierce secrecy, and the guarded, almost mystical craftsmanship that define the greatest era of jazz?
That is a great question.
It is something for you to chew on the next time you queue up a classic track. Thanks for diving deep with us.